I'm Franco Terrazzano.
And I'm Todd McKay.
This is the Canadian Taxpayers Podcast, and we're dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. And we've got something a bit different for you today.
I got the chance to interview Dr. Saqib Qureshi. He's just released a book, and it's called Broken Contract. It's about the ways accountability has been eroded in government and things we can do to make it better.
Dr. Qureshi is a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, and he's written for Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, and he's now living in Markham, Ontario. And Todd, you were telling me about his book, Broken Contract, and there's an astonishing statistic about astronauts and federal bureaucrats in there.
Yeah, so when I was chatting with Dr. Qureshi, and this is in his book as well, he crunched some numbers. And it turns out if you apply to be the next NASA astronaut, you've got a better chance of getting that job and going to space than a Canadian federal bureaucrat has of getting fired.
Basically, it's pretty hard for the government to be accountable to taxpayers if it's virtually impossible for anyone to get fired. Well, without further ado, here's our interview with Dr. Qureshi.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Saqib Qureshi. He's a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. He lives in Markham, Ontario, just outside of Toronto. And he's written a book called Broken Contract. Thank you so much for joining us today, Saqib.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
And I will say, you've just been coaching me on how to pronounce your name, and I apologize for getting it wrong from time to time. But I want to ask you, number one, you wrote a book called Broken Contract. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that book. Why did you write it?
So the book really is about the nature of democracy in the West. And the reason I wrote it is that I began to realize that despite all of our self-belief that we lived in a democracy, that the essence of democracy, which is really about citizens being at the center of government, of really about people power, which is how the expression democracy comes into being. It's really people power, and kind of realizing that we don't really have people power. We have all sorts of political games and shenanigans, and we've got a government which is 99% unelected. But we don't really have this sense of the people are in power. And I became more aware of it in interactions with the public sector and comparing those with my interactions in the private sector. And there came a point where I thought, you know what, let's kind of make sense of this. Why is it the case that it doesn't feel as if the system, the political system, revolves around ordinary people? It feels like a bit of a game and a dance in which ordinary citizens are to be manipulated or to be kind of dealt with on the margins almost.
I think a lot of us feel that way. It fuels a lot of the conversations we have at the coffee shop. But in your book, you describe a really specific circumstance that kind of crystallizes it. And I'd like you to tell that story. There should be a park beside your house. You asked a lot of questions about that. Tell us that story.
Right. So 2010, when we bought our to-be constructed home, we were told by the developer and by the local town that, by the city of Markham, in fact, that a park would be built across the street. And it was a fascinating journey, in fact, because we began writing in emails to councillors and officials in 2012 and 13 and what have you, asking when is this park going to be built and what kind of amenities will be in this park. And after much pushing and pulling and straggling, we were eventually told that the park would be completed in 2016. Nothing was done then. We had multiple consultation sessions, and supposedly our feedback was taken on board. And we petitioned the mayor. His office completely ignored the petition. There was for many of us, this was a very educational experience. It was the realization that this is not an effective system. This is poor government. This is very poor government. It's 2020 now. The park still isn't there. We've been told some of the features that will be part of the park, which the entire community is dead against. So that speaks to not only the delay, but it also speaks to the lack of listening. And I find it kind of interesting that the people who promised us a park, and they put it in writing, in fact, they've long since retired. They're now on one of the most generous pension plans on the planet. There are no consequences for the lack of delivery. There is no consequence for the city. Our taxes have to be paid on time, to the nearest cent, without which we are in penalty. But it's just amazing that the government can completely wash its hands of its own obligations, yet demand the obligations of citizens. And that equation is something that I think we've lost sight of. We've lost sight of government being responsible for performing, and then the people having a mechanism to hold those people, those same government officials, to account if things don't go as they should.
There's one specific aspect of that story that I wanted to focus in on. You went to a community meeting to talk about it. You asked officials there, what's going on with the park and why should we trust you? Tell me that story. I think it really crystallizes the situation well.
Right. So this is, I think, in 2019, when so many of us citizens had become so frustrated with empty promises, with a complete lack of remorse, a complete lack of apology about, okay, you know what, we promised this in 2010, it's 2019 now, we owe it to you to at least say sorry, we've completely messed up. So none of that was there. What was there was the response, was my question. Actually, I asked a question to the audience of government officials. I said, why should we trust you now, given your repeat track record of failure? Why should we take what you are saying at face value? Because even in writing, you put that this park would be completed 3 years ago, and there's absolutely no sign of activity here. And the deputy mayor kind of hit the nail on the head. He said, well, don't. What choice do you have? And I was like, that's a very, very interesting point, because if my service provider was in the private sector, we don't like monopolies in the private sector, so we have choice, and then we'll go somewhere else. In the public sector, not only does government take taxes up front, whether you like it or whether you don't, on time, every time, but it feels that it has no ethical responsibility to perform, let alone outperform the private sector. And the arrogance of the statement was quite disturbing. It was like, if you don't trust us, well, that's your problem, even though we performed in the fashion that no sane person would trust. I'm sorry, but that's just not acceptable. And I think it's symptomatic of much, much deeper issues with respect to the relationship between citizen and state. I think citizens have lost their ownership of government. We've really become so removed from the way our taxes are spent and the accountability of that spending, that we are fundamentally disillusioned or increasingly frustrated with the way our politics is unfolding.
One of the things I found most shocking about that statement, it's shocking to hear somebody say, don't trust me, you don't have any choice anyway. The thing that I actually found shocking when I read it, though, was not that I'm surprised that that point of view is in government. It was surprising to hear somebody say it out loud. That was almost the most shocking part of it, that it's normal. It's almost normal. We all build it into it. I want to get beyond the park thing. I'm not going to talk about that the whole time, But I do want to touch on one last thing with it. It is important. It's easy, I think, for people to shrug it off, say, it's a park, no big deal. But I want to make this a little bit more personal. How old were your kids when you moved into that house, and how old are they now?
So our eldest son at the time we moved in 2012, and so he was 7. No, he was 6, and now he is 14. So there's an awful lot of potential park experience that he could have enjoyed that he's missed out on. Actually, one of our neighbors has seen their eldest son go off to university. He was 11 when they moved in, and now he's 19, 20, 21. And so he's moved out, he's at university. And so that family moved in with the expectation that they'd have a park in a few years for their son to play around with, but that's just completely lost. And I think, you've kind of hit something there with the opportunity cost. We are denied something that we should have received. But park is a leisure space. Now, what happens if there's a road that's delayed by a year or two? There's a phenomenal financial cost, because people have to take alternative means. There's typically a lot more pollution thrown out. There is a lot more time that's wasted amongst commuters to get from A to B. So it's just not a question of leisure activity. There's some very practical, hard implications for government delays. And unfortunately, it's normal for a government project to be delayed. It's just like, water is wet, government project is delayed.
And that's exactly where I'm going on my next question. Almost every government project that I've seen has gone over budget and over schedule. I can count probably on one hand the number of examples I can think of where that wasn't the case. You've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Why do government projects always go over budget?
Well, there's a lack of accountability, because the people who sign off on the projects know full well that they won't be held accountable for the delay. They know full well that they will not be held accountable for the cost overrun. That's part of it. And the other part of it is that the competency of people in government is typically lower than it is in the private sector. And that's a function of the war for talent. Talent, or the most capable, or certainly the most ambitious amongst us, not always, but there's a tendency to work for the private sector. They want to work in outperforming environments where people do get fired for underperformance. Whereas in the public sector, it's close to impossible. I mean, in the federal government, for instance, right now it is practically impossible to be fired. And if I were to kind of give you an illustration of that point, it's almost polemical. In fact, you've got a situation here where in the federal government, between 1 in 3,000 civil servants is fired per year for underperformance. 1 in 3,000. The private sector comparison is about 1 in 100. And to give you a flavor as to what 1 in 3,000 actually looks like, NASA's 2017 astronaut program recruited 1 person for every 1,307 applicants. So statistically, you have a greater chance of applying to the NASA astronaut program and being selected than you have of being fired by the federal government of Canada for underperformance. So, how do you expect a big project to remain within budget and timeline if the talent that you have is not quite good enough? Forget the accountability issues, because like I said, we touched upon those, but how do you expect to deliver? And then you have a profound ethical question around the taxation issue, because taxes aren't just paid out by the wealthy. Homeless people pay taxes. People below the poverty line pay taxes. They may not pay income tax, they definitely pay sales tax. So you now have taxes paid by some of the poorest people in our country to help fund the employment of suboptimal talent to deliver suboptimal results.
I have to say, after I read your book, I've told a number of people your illustration that the odds of getting fired as an employee of the federal government are much lower than of being chosen as the next astronaut for NASA. That's absolutely baffling. I mean, there's lots of good people that work for government, but they're not all good. It's striking that it's virtually impossible to get fired. Why is that? Why is nobody held accountable in the bureaucracy? Why is it so hard to get rid of poor performers?
It's not just the bureaucracy where you have issues of accountability. You have it amongst elected representatives as well. So, I mean, if I engage the core question of the bureaucracy, there is no mechanism in place to fire people for poor performance. That mindset, that culture doesn't exist. It simply is not there. You have got to be really outstandingly incompetent to get fired by the Canadian government. I mean, that in itself would be newsworthy. I got fired by the Canadian government for underperformance. Wow, that's a big deal. Okay, so you don't actually have the culture in place to force that accountability metrics. Now, to give you an illustration of how top down this becomes, when our elected representatives, when our MPs stand for election, they make a bunch of claims about what they'll do and what they won't do. They get into office, they then choose their prime minister. So straight away, they have very few resources, powers, legislative tools at their disposal. They just go ahead and choose a prime minister or their party leader. That party leader decides the agenda, and that's enforced through the whips. You also have some lobbying, you also have some paid consultancy work, and all the rest of it. And so you come back in 4 years' time, or this MP comes back in 4 years' time and says, I did the following, A, B, C, and D. There's no record of this. It's just his claim or her claim. We have no idea what they were doing for an entire 4-year period or a 5-year period. They could be twiddling their thumbs playing Xbox all day, and we wouldn't have the faintest idea of what was on. I mean, I don't know what my MP has done this entire calendar year, except the nice bits and pieces that my MP has decided to share on social media. But there's no independent, there's nothing for me to go on. So except, a bunch of hot air. So how does that mechanism enable accountability? It can't do. I mean, imagine recruiting somebody in the private sector. That person makes a ton of promises at interview stage, goes away for 4 years with very few personal resources at their disposal in terms of resources to be used for that job, comes back in 4 years' time and says, well, I actually achieved a whole bunch of bits and pieces, and I want another 4-year contract at $100,000 a year, plus perks, plus the most generous pension plan on the planet. I mean, how is that accountability? That's not accountability. I don't know what that is, but it's not accountability. So it's not just a civil service issue. Mm-hmm. The lack of accountability is integral to the way our democracy has evolved, and so what I find disturbing is that we think democracy is simply about a vote every 4 years. I mean, that's at least the headline, or every 5 years. I don't think that's remotely accurate. I think our democracy is about a contract, a social contract, which we've been playing around with for centuries. It's not a new instrument. At the kind of core of this contract is that we want, as people, for our government to be representative, to be accountable to us, and to be effective in their uses of taxes, not to waste our tax money. Okay, that is the essence of what we want from our democracy. It's not so much I want to put my vote in the ballot box. It's really representation, accountability, and efficiency of taxes. We don't have that. We just don't have that. And I think if you step back and are prepared to say democracy is about people power, yes, it's people power through accountability, through representation, and through the efficient use of tax dollars. That's really what this is about. And I think to ignore the 99.5% of government, which we do so completely as part of the accountability framework, is a disaster. Because if 99.5% is unaccountable, is riddled with way too much poor performance, there's no insight as to who's doing what, then little wonder that so many people think that the government is giving 15, 20, 30% of its budget to foreign aid. Well, in Canada, it's about 3%.
When we go back to some of those issues in improving accountability, what are your thoughts? What are a few of your ideas that you look at to make things more accountable?
So I see no reason why our elected representatives, and for that matter, quite possibly the entire civil service, does not put up their individual agenda, their diary up, their work diary up every single day. I would want to know what my MP was doing at 3 p.m. today. Why? Because amongst other citizens, I'm paying for her salary. So that's the first thing. Yes, there are some national security considerations and some extreme sensitivities which we can develop mechanisms to vet. But in principle, there is no reason why we can't see the agendas of those people who we are paying salaries for. And in particularly with MPs or MEPs or councillors, these people have promised us bits and pieces. Okay, so that leads me to my second thing, which is that I would begin to encourage the treating of these commitments and promises somewhat sacrosanct. I mean, at the moment, it just seems to be a fire hose. The elected candidate stands up, makes 50 claims, some of which are to individual people behind the scenes, some of which are very public, the vast majority of which they have very few resources to effect. Okay, and then there's absolutely no independent assessment as to whether they've done those bits and pieces. There's nothing. So what I would be arguing for is, look, you know what? You've made these commitments. Here's your roster, and now we're going to do an annual review, an annual audit. We'll see how you do. We'll see how you fare, which is part of any job. I mean, you employ somebody, the least that you could do is give them an annual review in terms of what they've achieved against what they said they'll achieve. So I mean, that's just two examples of what we can throw out there to make our government more accountable. I mean, I'm tempted to go further, which is that if you have a project which is delayed and there's cost overruns, I would want the people who signed off personally accountable. I really would want them on the line in very much similar fashion to what happens in the private sector. I mean, you have to bear in mind that 75% or 70% of private sector employees in Canada work for small businesses. They work for small businesses. Can you imagine a private sector employee telling their business manager backslash CEO backslash shareholder, look, you know what, this project that I was meant to do in the next 6 months, it will take 2.5 years now, and it'll be 40% over budget. Well, where's the personal accountability and liability there? Why is that person, I mean, do we really expect that private sector employee to have a job? Probably not. So why do we expect the civil servant to have a job? And perhaps, might I add, that the civil service or the public sector employees very often have some of the most important jobs around. They are taking care of the sick, they are teaching the young children, they are protecting our communities, whether through the fire services or the police forces. They do have some incredibly important roles to fulfill. So why are we giving them buckets of latitude, which in the private sector you wouldn't see? And I mean, you can't fix all of this without also then fixing issues around the war for talent. You really do have to create a value proposition to bring in smart, capable, competent people on a regular basis. And that's missing. Top tier university graduates simply do not apply to the public sector, even though the public sector employs hundreds of thousands of people.
I want to come back. I'm going to bring up an example on the political side of a specific promise and how you could look at handling that if it didn't work out. But I want to take you back to the bureaucracy just quickly. You talked about if projects go over budget, they go off the rails, that people should be individually accountable. How many? You talk about actually letting people go in the civil service. What would those numbers look like? It's almost unimaginable because we never have that conversation. But what should the turnover rate be in terms of federal government employees?
So I've suggested, a 2% minimum number of civil servants per year to be removed. So you take the bottom 2% of performers and you say, thank you very much, you had your chance. And likewise, you adequately compensate and reward the top 5% of outperformers. There's no two ways around it. I'm not a big fan of the lower compensation levels in the top echelons of the public sector, because if you compare what some of the most senior civil servants, some of the most accomplished members of the public service earn compared to what they might earn in the private sector, I'm not entirely sure it's healthy for taxpayers that the public sector staff, the top performing, are so underpaid. But at the same time, I do think that you've got a heavy mass in the middle, which is remarkably well compensated. And so I would be turning around to that core and saying, look, guys, bottom 2% of performers every year out. No ifs, no buts, no political strings, no, knocking on the door of the permanent secretary or whoever else, but it's game over. And we've got to exert that discipline, not just for, the wealthy taxpayers, who drive around fancy cars and own big houses. No, this is done because taxes are extracted from people who are homeless, and it's the lower socioeconomic end of society that most relies on the public sector. So, we owe it to that branch of our society, the branch that needs us most, to outperform for them. And you can't do that if 1 in 3,000 people a year is fired for poor performance. It is an absolute debacle of organization in government to say 1 in 3,000 people per year will get fired for poor performance. Whereas, like I say, in the private sector, 1 in 150, 1 in 130, 1 in 100. So let's raise the game. Let's rapidly raise the game so that our civil service is a performing civil service, not one that kind of clocks in at 9:00 a.m. and clocks out at 5:00 p.m. And the sad reality is that the vast bulk, not everybody, so I don't want to paint the public sector with a massive brush, but the vast majority will clock out 15 minutes after they're meant to. Whereas in the private sector, outperformers are way more plenty. They will work harder. They will take way less sick days, and I use the word sick days in quotation. I mean, for instance, in 2019, full-time public sector employees took 62% more sick days than did private sector employees. I mean, is there something wrong with the way we recruit people in the public sector that they are more sick? I mean, is that part of the recruitment criteria that you've had to have, a major illness that, you have to take 62% more sick days? Or do we turn around and say, you know what, that is wonderfully symptomatic of the lack of performance, of the lack of accountability that's so embedded in our cultural fabric. And we really don't do ourselves a favor by forgetting that the public sector exists most for the people who most need it, who most need that sector. Okay, and we don't do ourselves any favors by ignoring the fact that people who don't have a home above their head or any shelter, who are below the poverty line, are still funding that same sector. They're not funding Starbucks because they can't afford it. They're not funding fancy restaurants hither and thither. They are actually paying for that lack of performance, for those extra 62% more sick days.
Okay, when we talk about specific questions, listen, I want to be very clear. I don't think it's a partisan issue to say that different governments of all stripes break promises. No government, no color of party has failed to break promises. But I want to give you a specific example. In the 2015 election, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made it very clear, he made it very specifically clear that he would balance the budget in 2019, and he didn't, continued to run deficits. How would you handle that when you're talking about your accountability structure? What would you do in a scenario like that?
Okay, so let's just break this down a little bit. Supposing we employ somebody to head up our finance department in the private sector. We're running a 20-man ship, private sector corporation, finance manager's in charge of the costs. He comes in, we tell him, look, you got to balance the budget. He says, yes, I'll balance the budget. 3 years later, that's not the case, right? Ordinarily, that person's job should be on the line. Now, this is pre-COVID, so COVID is obviously a game changer, but ordinarily, I would think that person's job is on the line. There is absolutely no way in the reality of our politics and government that Prime Minister Trudeau's job will be on the line. So he's broken a promise. He's committed something and he's failed to deliver. So what are the consequences? The way we've got our system structured, it does not entertain anything except the fire hose that hits us at election time. And the fire hose is populated, is overwhelmed with information, misinformation, lies, semi-truths. So we get hit with an absolute battery of stuff, okay, some of which actually has nothing to do with rational debate. It's to do with identity, it's to do with all sorts of other, driving motivators for our vote. So if he's made this commitment, which he did, and he's failed miserably, I don't see how he is not seriously challenged for his job. Not like in an election process. I'd like to understand the basis upon which he, or any prime minister for that matter, can say, yeah, you know what, I promised this, and it's part of the reason why you elected me. There've been no major, massive hiccups. Like we haven't had World War III breakout, and it's 2019. And in 2019, I failed miserably on something which is actually quite serious. It's not like a minor piece in the pie. I mean, balancing the budget is actually quite a big commitment, quite a big issue. So I want to see mechanisms in place where politicians who commit a particular item, whether it's, well, particularly if it's serious, that their jobs are on the line, that they're personally held accountable, that is part of any employment contract. I don't see why the public sector should be so low performing that we can say, yeah, you know what, it's just the public sector, it's one of those things. They always fail. They always get things wrong. They always delay things and they're always above budget. No, but I'm sorry, but that doesn't work. That shouldn't work. We should own our government. We should own our state, in a way that we own. I mean, you have to bear in mind that 40% of our income ends up in the public sector, if not more, because you have sales taxes as well. So, it's a significant chunk. So we should be way more demanding of people who take their money from us upfront every time on time.
That's interesting you said that, because that's exactly where I want to go next. I think you're making the point that it's not an accountable democracy just because we have elections. That's an important part of it. But just because you mark a ballot every 4 years doesn't mean you're holding people accountable. What else should we be doing? Let's turn the mirror around a little bit. What should we be doing to hold our government more accountable?
So what we can do, I think, number one, is simply develop an awareness of what is in front of us. So I think too many people are misled by politicians who would love to emphasize that, in fact, we live in a democracy and this is how things are and this is how things ought to be and we shouldn't change. But I think there needs to be a much greater awareness of, okay, what is democracy? Democracy is people power. Okay? Do we really have that? Do we really have people in power, or do we have something completely different? Do we have accountability? I think these kind of conceptual things have got to start to play out in our population through social media, through the media itself as well. But we can also challenge our representative. We can also say, look, you know what? In 2015, you said that you'll do this if you got elected, but you haven't done it. And so explain this to me. I think we can also go out there and push for specific changes. For instance, we can go out there and say, look, as part of our democracy, ordinary people, deserve the right to be part of government, which has implications for career politicians, and it has implications for career public servants. For career politicians, I see no reason why they should be in politics for more than 10, 12, 15 years. Honestly, after that, my attitude is go get a real job. Go work like everybody else does, without having to play games and shaking hands and all the rest of that stuff. And somebody will push back and say, oh, well, if the people want to elect me, then that's great. But number one, incumbent politicians have a massive advantage in any election round because they have a bigger fundraising advantage. They can raise more money for their campaign. So that's a huge advantage. They already have some name recognition. So let's not forget that. But also, our pushback needs to be, yes, we get that your constituents want you or they've elected you, but dude, our democracy is more important. We want to have ordinary people in the legislature. We don't want to have lifers. I find it quite weird that Andrew Scheer is since the age of 25, he spent, a couple of months in the insurance industry and as a waiter or something in the restaurant industry. And the rest of his 15, 16 years has been in politics. Really, that's it. Game over. Go do something else. Go learn something about how ordinary people have to live their lives. And that speaks to the reality that our politicians are brilliant. They're really, really good at getting elected. Their track record in anything else is pretty appalling. They really are not the most capable and competent people in our society, which is why I find it so obvious that so many people that I know who are genuinely capable, who have achieved bucket loads, wouldn't want anything to do with elected politics, in terms of being candidates themselves. Who would want to be part of an audience where elected politicians go around making stuff up, smearing opposition candidates, all of that mess that goes with it, and not really talking about issues, not really demonstrating their track record, what they've actually achieved.
What are some of the things that individual Canadians, everyday Canadians, can do to make their government a little bit more accountable?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is to treat the core promises and commitments that are made during the election cycle with respect, even if politicians won't do that themselves. So quite often they're willing to commit to delivering the sky and the universe and all the rest of it, and 2 weeks after being elected, it's all practically history. And I think we have an obligation to remind politicians, look, this is what you've committed, and perhaps even go a step further and say, look, we want it in black and white online, your commitments, your promises, your commitments, and then force the dedication of tax resources to independently audit or independently verify those promises or commitments 12 months on, 24 months on. So that changes the entire cycle of our accountability, because we take back power as citizens by holding elected representatives to their word. And that doesn't happen. It's just honestly, I'm struggling to figure out what is the point of listening to politicians who will make up a bunch of promises that in many cases they won't adhere to, who will say contradictory things and then brush them under the carpet, and there's no real mechanism in place to do a performance evaluation akin to what we have in the private sector.
There's always more work to be done. I suspect the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we're going to continue working towards accountable government for a long time. I don't think that job's going to be done completely, but we can always make it better. And you know what, Dr. Qureshi, your book, Broken Contract, is another important step in that direction. I think it'll get people talking. I think there's a lot of useful ideas in it. Thank you so much for writing it. Thank you so much for joining us today. Any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
I think really we as citizens deserve to have a government which outperforms, and we need to start asking ourselves questions around, look, we're paying 40, 50% of our annual income into the government coffers? Is it really delivering value for money? Is it really accountable to us? And we need to draw a line under what we have right now, because the political frustrations that are emerging from a lack of democracy, are just going to get worse. So we either go down the route of the lunatic fringe, or we take control of democracy and then make it real and make it a positive experience for not only the people who fund it, but the people who are part of it.
Those are important points. Thanks again, Dr. Qureshi. Thank you so much again for taking the time to chat with us. Your book, Broken Contract, it's available now. We're going to have links in the show notes. I encourage people to go out and take a look. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Saqib Qureshi. And don't worry, we've got a link to his book, Broken Contract, in our show notes. And a big thanks, as always, to James Wood for editing all these interviews. And of course, thank you for listening to the Canadian Taxpayers Podcast.